Thank you very, very much for letting me share the knowledge that we've created over the last few years and the knowledge that we've gained from the environment to everybody in Treaty 4. As I start, we'll start with acknowledgements that these are the traditional lands of the Saulteaux, the Cree, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. The second piece there is actually from high schools in Regina. I'm from Montreal, you'll see that in a second, but my history, my understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples is very limited. It's always bothered me that I've never really known what's going on in the history of the country. And so Doug recently had us do a professional development day in which we tried to understand better treaty issues. And since I have no history in it, this was something that I was very interested in. I saw a film called The Pass System, which if you've never seen, you should, if nothing else, to educate yourself. And we had Elder Betty speak to us and offer an opening prayer. And it was an illumination for me. And really what I realized was how badly colonial history has let down the First Nations. And so with that, I acknowledge that we do honor the treaties. And I think I have checked with the president of the university. The university supports the treaties and acknowledges the harm that has been done in the past and seeks to rectify it. There's different words there, but that's from me. Mostly, I just want to sincerely thank everybody for sharing the land. I have a piece of land out by Craven towards Last Mountain Lake, or Kanukama, as I think the traditional name is for it. And I'm there holding it in abeyance for the next generation. It's not mine, I'm not going to keep it. And I think if we all take that view that it's going to be a lot easier to reconcile, and you heard Heather speak earlier that the power of Indigenous treaty rights, and I just want to reinforce that, and I will finish with the same story that I'm starting with. Finally, I just want to thank the elders this morning for allowing me to be part of their pipe ceremony and open up a path for us to talk with their Creator and to better understand each other's cultures and to open a dialogue for sharing and for protecting the environment. Everything starts with a journey, and so I want to give you a bit of history for me for how I ended up here. You ever heard of the 23andMe DNA kits? Well, I did that, or my brother did it, and we asked the question, where did we come from? This is where I came from. I'm apparently purebred Irish, which is really bizarre, as I'll explain in a second, but this is where my family's from. And looking back, my family's one of those families that actually pays attention to history. And so I know that we arrived in North America somewhere in the mid-1600s. And my seventh generation, which was Abraham Leavitt and Hannah Burnhen, they all stayed in the sort of the New England area of the country, and then I was born, and that happened to be in Montreal, but more or less the same area. Since then, it's been a little more complicated. I left Montreal when I was 17. I spent time in Kingston, Ontario. I spent time in the United States. My father was American. And I spent time in Winnipeg, Madison, Wisconsin, Edmonton, and then I've been here since 1993. So this is my journey to Treaty 4. 7 generations in the past is significant. 7 generations in the future is also significant. I can't see that far ahead, but I can see 1 generation ahead. This is my son, Luke. It's missing a line. It should say, I like my friends, I like Lego, I love the forest, but I really, really love ice cream. That would be the key thing for Luke. But Luke was an unexpected treasure for us. This is the easy part for me because this is just science. You heard the phrase environmental change in society and you went, yeah, God, couldn't you just say it simpler? Okay, so the way I look at the world is there's the sort of the built world, the thing we made, we being people, and then there's the natural world, and they interact with each other and they feed back. So there's changes in the environment, they affect us, and we affect the environment back. And what I seek to do is understand how our actions affect the environment and how the environment feeds back on us, and all the complexities that are there. I find that's a really useful way of looking at the past, but also how to look in the future. So the work we've been doing has been done at the University of Regina since we started in the lakes in 1994. And some of the work is looking just at water quality, and we've been doing monitoring since that time, trying to understand how the water quality has changed. And part of this is because the way we change the environment is very slow, almost imperceivably in this busy world. And so it's helpful for us to just keep looking at things the same way. Because then if you look at it the same way for long periods of time and things start to change, you have some chance of being able to explain why. The other thing I'd like to do is look back in the past. There's many traditions for doing this, but the one from my people, I guess, from the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill said that the further back into the past you look, the further into the future you'll be able to see. And that's always kind of informed my way of thinking, is that, you know, we're as a people, we're kind of about now. We got through the last bit, don't care. But what's the next bit? And so we're not very good at forecasting, and so we're all about place and sense. And I think sometimes you have to look back and then look forward to understand why the world is the way it is now. And the reason we want to do this is to try and understand what things might look like in the future. And so I look in the past, I look in the present, and I'm seeking to predict the future. So here's where we are. Here's specifically where we are. If we were up in space and we could see down on the planet, we would see that we live in a grassland. We live in an area where there's too little water to grow trees. And this, from the best we can determine, has been the case for at least 8,000 years. It's possible after the glaciers left that there were forests here because it was cooler, and so the water was less likely to evaporate. And there is some evidence of that. But since that time, it has been dry. It has been so dry in the past, in fact, that the Lake Manitoba here was dry. You can see grass layers in the sediments down about 6,000 years ago. So one of the things to learn is that the world is never the same constantly. It may seem the same because we don't necessarily understand why it's changing, or we don't necessarily perceive it's changing, but it's always changing. I'm trying to explain why I decided to work on the Qu'Appelle. There were two reasons I moved to Saskatchewan. One, I love the people at the university. I love the camaraderie. I love their intelligence. I love their dedication, their passion. But the Qu'Appelle was the other really convincing reason why I moved here. It was a remarkable system and remains that way to this day. The water originates near Eyebrow and comes all the way down, and in the same way that my vein will drain blood to my heart, I believe the Qu'Appelle supplies water to the rest of Treaty 4. It is the central artery of the treaty, and so while that wasn't my intention when I started, I can certainly see that it is true now. So the lakes we work on, we look at 7 lakes, and scientifically we take a lot of different tools and a lot of different ways of looking at things, and I won't get into too many details, but there's biology which should be more familiar to you. We might look at the invertebrates, the bugs, the things that run across the top of the water, the things that dive below the water. We'll look at the green stuff as well, the algae as I'll call them, but I'll just refer to it as greenness, but it's the scum on the top of the lake or mixed through the water. If you take a container of water from the lakeshore and just put it in a quiet place, it'll separate out into different types of algae, some that float, some that don't, and you'll get a sense that the community is diverse. And we've monitored during the summers mostly for every 2 weeks since we started. We started in about June of 2014 and have been going constantly since. So this is, in Canada, the longest running freshwater research program outside of the government. So it is, we are unique in that sense. This is what it's like. You know this probably far better than I do. I spend a lot of time behind my desk writing things. My students are all out. They're out having a blast. They're out sampling. If you ever see that weird pontoony looking boat, that the Coast Guard won't use because it's too unreliable, that's us. We get in the water, we muck around, we look at the streams, we look at the wetlands, or we're starting to look more at the wetlands now, and trying to understand why is the water green in one spot and not in the other, why is this year a good year and last year was not so good. And we take the water and we probe it, we ask it questions, we say, why are you so green? How green are you? So we take the water and we do little experiments where we add stuff in and we take stuff out and we see what happens. And we filter things. We're big on filtering. Filtering is a lot of fun. No, it's not. It's boring. But anyway, you remove things, you separate the water into different parts, and it gives you a sense of what the components are. And we do have a lot of fun. We attract people from around the world to work in the community and understand Saskatchewan better. All these people work in Saskatchewan now in some form or another. Some have moved on to Alberta, but a lot of people stay in the prairies as a result of what they've learned at the university. We can go back in time, and this is the part that I like best. This is a photo of me when I was younger and slimmer. The idea here is that what lives in the lake dies in the lake, and its remains settle out. The fossil record forms, and you go deeper into the water column or deeper into the sediments. This is yesterday, and then older and older and older and older. And you can look and you can probe the sediments for little things like this, which is a little green cell that has a very specific pattern of stripes on it. And that pattern of stripes tells us who they are, what they like, and what the environment must have been like at the time they died. That allows us to actually reconstruct changes in water quality, the saltiness of the water in this case. This is for Stony Lake or Humboldt Lake, right just south of Humboldt. And this is a 2,000-year record of the saltiness, in which there was a period of 500 years in which the lake was half as salty as the ocean. That's 15 grams of salt in a liter of water. It's very salty. And then there's a period in which not much was going on, up and down, up and down, up and down. We don't know why, something to do with climate change. But then, interestingly, the worst water quality in the entire 2,000-year record occurred in the 30 years leading into the signing of Treaty 4. You have to ask yourself, if we're worried about the 1930s, which for reference is down here, what must it have been like? What must have been the forces on people here? What must have been the effect on the environment? And so I would, you know, one of the things that I continuously am thinking about is, were people actually forced to sign treaties because there was no other choice? Yes, the buffalo was dying. But if I'm a buffalo and I've got no water, and there's people with guns, I might go away. I might go north or west or east. I might just get out of the area. And so you wonder how much pressure might have been put on people here as a result of climate variability and climate change. And we're going to come back to this idea of climate change a little bit later. I like time. There's me. I was blonde, I was brown, with short hair and long hair, and I'm gray haired. The nice thing about gray hair is you always know what color it is going to be tomorrow. It's constant. I'm good here. As long as it's there, it's going to be great. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you three little stories, or three small histories. One successful, one we're not so certain about, and then some warnings for the future, or some advice that maybe we need to start thinking about. So I want to talk about the success story, or one of the success stories, which is improving the water quality in the Qu'Appelle. I won't say that it's done yet, but we're certainly headed in the right direction. I want to talk about the effects of climate change, because it is getting warmer. The earth sciences, the physics, this science is unambiguous on this. There's personal belief systems that come into it, but the information is really difficult to argue with. Then I want to talk about the challenges to Treaty 4 waters. So let's start with maybe the success story, or the better story. So we've been measuring changes in water quality in the Qu'Appelle, principally arising because of the city of Regina over the last 25 years. Actually, we've been doing this for longer than that, because, as I say, time is a funny thing. You can't always tell it's changing as you go along. We do know, however, that the city of Regina's wastewater is released into the creek, and you know, if the city of Regina was spread out over the whole province, it'd have no effect, because the population density is just not high enough at that scale to make any difference. But that's not the case. We should be in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest city on the smallest body of water. We are in the Guinness Book of World Records for Albert Street Bridge, which is the most over-engineered structure in the whole planet, the largest span for the smallest body of water. Anyway, the point here is that it's a ratio problem. We have too many people releasing everything that we've concentrated from all over the planet into one tiny little creek, and it's going into the Qu'Appelle. And so it's coming straight in that way. As a result, or at least in part, we see that there are serious problems with the water quality in the Qu'Appelle lakes. There are blooms of algae, the scum that floats in it, the greenness, some of which are toxic. That is, they produce biological compounds which cause us problems. And these are the players, these are the bad guys. Annie, Fanny, and Mike. Annie is Anabina. It's this little wormy looking thing. It's really small, it's actually about that size. And it gives the water kind of a gray cast, gray-green cast. And so if you're on Qu'Appelle Lake and you see the water looking a bit gray, that's probably the reason. Fanny is a Phanosomenon, which is a mouthful, so Fanny's fine. And it looks like somebody dumped their grass cuttings into the water. It looks like there's little bits of grass in the water all the time, and so it's easy to see. And then Mike is Microcystis, and this is the bad one. This one produces a lot of cellular toxins. If you ever hear about cattle dying because of poor water quality, that's almost always involved. Your dogs, you feel sick to the stomach. It's not much of a challenge for humans because it's not well absorbed by our stomachs, but it's still a problem. These are all cyanobacteria. They're a type of green algae, and so Mike is easy to spot because it looks like paint that's been dropped on the water. So they're all pretty easy to tell apart, and if you just looked long enough, you'd have a sense of whether they were getting better or worse, and so that's what we've tried to do. We do know that the city has changed its waste treatment process over time. We've reconstructed in my lab. We worked out how much waste might be coming from the city in the past. And then when all the houses went on pipes, everything came in really suddenly. And then in 1977, certain nutrients were removed from the waste stream, whereas others, blue or nitrogen, which you're probably familiar with, it didn't decline. So we were curious about whether nitrogen was a problem or whether the water quality would get better, because if it was the red one, things should get better right away, and if it was the blue one, then things probably got worse, if anything. And we can go back, we can use the mud to ask, how much pollution do you think the lake received? And so here's the record for Buffalo Pound above the wastewater input from the city, and Pasqua from receiving it. And you can see that Buffalo Pound changes very little through time. It doesn't really matter what the numbers are, they're pretty flat, nothing's changing. This is not true of Pasqua Lake. You can see that around the time of the treaty formation, the water was pretty stable, and then since that, we've seen increases in pollution. This increase in pollution maps onto how green the waters have been. We can see that there has been no time since Treaty 4 was signed that the water quality is as good as it was then. Never. It has always been worse, and it's been getting worse. Whether it can get much worse than it is now is unknown. So we were really curious about, okay, is this real? Like, is this really a cause? If this goes up, if the nitrogen goes up, excuse me, do we get greener algae? And the reason we want to know is we've also started measuring toxins, this biological molecule from the algae. This is a complicated figure, and all I want, it's arranged as a cross along the long axis of the Qu'Appelle with the side from Last Mountain and Wascana draining in upstream of Pasqua. There's two sets of dashed lines and a bunch of green-blue curves. The dark curves are in the past, and the light curves are now. So there's Last Mountain Lake, and that's now, and that's the past. And then there's these red lines. The drinking red line means any blue line above that means there's enough toxin in it that you cannot drink the water without treatment. The more problematic line here is the dark red one. That's the contact line. Don't touch. Don't go swimming. Don't let your animals in. And recently, we've started to see in Pasqua Lake, but also upstream and occasionally close downstream, toxin levels that are approaching these contact advisories. So something's going on here. You know, we're trying to understand why this is happening. And it's not just the Qu'Appelle. So we've monitored 100 lakes, mostly within Treaty 4. And this is the map of where the lakes are, and this is the map of where the toxins are. Anything that's green to blue has water that cannot be consumed without being treated. I'll make it easy. That's all of the lakes. Now, would this be natural, or would this be related to our land use practices? We're not certain. This is very early information. We're not entirely certain what the meaning is. If we went out in spring, we would see none of these toxins. It's very much something that occurs more late in the summer. So there's spring and there's fall, and you can see these, the problem areas are sort of late in the year. So we've tried to understand why. The way you do science is you have an idea, I think it's nitrogen causing it, and then you test it with an experiment. And then you revise your idea and you test it again, you revise it. You never are right, you just fail to be wrong. It's a very weird way of going through life. But what we did is we take these big bags, kind of giant garbage bags, 2 meters across and 1 or 2 meters deep, and we add in different concentrations of different things and ask what effect that was. Picture's worth 1,000 words. It's also a lot easier than data. So this is the way the water is. It's pretty clear. You can see a white strip hanging in there. It's all good. And this is the nutrient that the city of Regina removed with their wastewater upgrade in 1977. It's pretty much the same. If anything, it's slightly clearer. And this is the same water where we just added nitrogen, the thing that wasn't removed from the city of Regina. You can see clearly the kind of problem, well, you can't see clearly, you can see scum. These are the kinds of problems that have continued. And so we use this information in conjunction with the changes in the federal laws about nitrogen pollution to first go to Winnipeg and convince the city of Winnipeg to upgrade their wastewater treatment plants at the cost of $750 million. And then we came back to Regina, ostensibly to embarrass the city by saying, you know, you're the only city in the prairies that doesn't remove nitrogen pollution, and look what it does. I wouldn't say that we were necessarily effective in getting that change. It could have maybe just happened with the federal legislation anyway, but it didn't hurt. And this is something that we think is important for any area like the grasslands around the world. This is the data that goes with it. It's the same thing, but basically if you add nitrogen, you get somewhere between 3 and 4 times, or 300 or 400% more greenness and more toxin just by adding the one thing that the city's not taking out. So there was a response. The city said, right, I guess the jury's in, we're the last ones, let's do something about it. So there was a referendum for the model that they wanted to use, but they did upgrade their wastewater stream, and they're using something called biological nutrient removal, which uses bacteria in the water that will naturally pick up the nitrogen and take it away. And so we expect what's going to happen, and this is early days. They just started the first trials in 2016 and full on last year. What we think is going to happen when you look at all the different sources of nitrogen, farms and atmospheric deposition, stuff coming up from the mud and runoff from the side and a lagoon coming down Loon Creek, and you put it all together, the city accounts for about half of all the nitrogen coming into the city. So it's the big player, it's the big dog in the field. So we think that the total nitrogen into the system, the thing causing the pollution, the thing that's causing the toxins, is going to decline by about half. So we expect about half as much, or 200% less green algae. We think the toxins in particular will stop because it's going to shift from that paint, Mike, to a Phanosomnon, Fanny, and that one's not quite as toxic. So far, not so much to report. I will say it took us 100 years to pollute Pasqua Lake. We will not return it back to its original condition in a few years. It's going to take probably decades. You just got to be patient. So far, if this is a measure of the greenness of the water, we lower this little very complicated disc into the water and we measure how far it can go in before it's gone. You can all do this. In fact, there's citizen science at the university that would ask you to do this so we can get more information. But you know, when the water's clear way up here, you can see it all the way down, and when the water's green or turbid or cloudy, you can't see it at all, and that's down towards the bottom here, cloudy. And you can see Lake Diefenbaker, the reservoir is pretty clear, and that drains water into Buffalo Pound. It's not so good. bounces around a lot, but there's really no trend. There's nothing going on. In Pasqua, same thing. Qu'Appelle, maybe getting slightly worse. Crooked, maybe getting slightly better. But all in all, not a whole lot of change. So after 2 years, we can say that so far we're not seeing the things that we'd hoped to see. But one of the things we did expect to see was that there was going to be a change in where the algae were in the water. We thought that we'd see more of the floaty things and less of the sinky things. Those are the technical terms. And so we've been measuring the whole time how much was right in the water that you dip a cup in, and how much was all the way through the lake, and just said, if that number is high, if we have a lot on the surface, then this number goes up, and if we have even numbers there and there, then it takes a value of 1. And what you can see is that most of the lakes are pretty flat. The Pasqua is getting a little more scummy, as is Qu'Appelle. Crooked, not so certain, maybe Last Mountain. Now this pattern is not the pattern you'd expect to see from the wastewater plant. It's possible, since the wastewater plant kicked in, it's been a little bit worse, but it's clearly risen quite a bit earlier than that. This is okay, because these floaty things, particularly this one, uses that little cell right there to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and use it itself. And until that starts to wind down, until that slows down, the lake will be slow to recover. So while this looks like, oh my goodness, you've made it worse, no, that's not true. In fact, arguably, it is slightly better in Pasqua Lake. It's certainly a tiny bit clearer than maybe it was before, but it's certainly not very different. So we've had some success here. We think that there's basically about 300 to 500 or 600% more algae in Pasqua and probably Echo Lake than was the case historically, that is when the Treaty 4 was signed. And the effects of pollution are less clear in the downstream lakes. Qu'Appelle, maybe there's twice as much, but Crooked and Round you don't see all that much. The effect of the city doesn't go that far. We certainly see that the city of Nitrogen, that's not bad, city of Regina has been one of the main sources, and that nitrogen certainly promotes the growth of toxic algae. So in removing the nitrogen, we expect the recovery will occur. We also expect it will take years to decades. And I'm sorry, you'll have to be patient. One of the reasons for me to come out here was so that people don't overreact to the thing that they see in the lake right now, but to take the long view of this, 7 generations forward, even 1 generation forward. Would it be okay if the water quality was back to natural levels, but it took 25 years? Is that so bad? So there are some complications though, and one of the complications is that climate may be changing in a way to make the water quality a little bit worse. So I'm going to go back to the big picture and then talk a little bit about climate here, and then we'll move forward to the last piece. So these are the lakes we work on, and I've taken Pasqua out of the mix here only because we know it has so much pollution from the city that it's very hard to see the climate effect separate from that. There's lots of climate stations, and records have been kept for at least 80 years that are reasonably reliable, and so we can ask the question, how much of the change that we've seen in the lakes, and remember it's pretty flat but it's bounding up and down, how much of that could be due to changes in the climate? So we've asked questions related to how much greenness is there scum on the surface, is the water clear? That's a pretty good no. And what are the presence of the toxic species? Do we see Annie, Fanny, or Mike? Are they problems, or is it different types of things? Some of these algae, they're a bit like lettuce. You can eat as much as you want, never get full. They're really not that helpful. Other ones more problematic. In principle, there's at least 4 things that would affect the water quality that aren't related to nutrients. Well, climate systems. Now, we're not talking about whether it's warm or dry today. We're talking about El Nino. We're talking about Farmer's Almanac level predictions of the climate and how it will change. We're supposed to get a dry winter this year, according to most of the U.S. science satellites. We know that local weather is important. In 2011, we had a situation where there was a fair bit of snow on the ground, but the ground had frozen solid in the fall and had been wet when it froze, and so when the snow melted, it came off all at once and very quickly, and we had that flooding all the way through from really Last Mountain Lake down all the way to Winnipeg. Lake conditions, individual lakes are not all lakes are exactly the same way that not all people are exactly the same. So sometimes there's something about the lake that's just weird, and you got to go with it. It's weird. And then there's also, as I say, water flow, because there's this general idea that the solution to pollution is dilution. Or is it? Is it that simple? So we took the data that we've been collecting and tried to get some thoughts on what was going on. And here I've just measured how green the lakes have been, how clear the water has been, and how many of those Annie, Fanny, and Mike scum things are there. There's not a whole lot gone on for 25 years. It's been pretty flat. That's not to say that it isn't bad. It's just it's not gotten a huge amount worse nor better. There are big differences between the lakes. It is always clear in Lake Diefenbaker, and it is always horrid in Wascana Lake. And those have to do a lot with the type of lakes. One's big and deep, and the nutrients can get trapped down deep, and the other one's shallow, and the nutrients just keep spinning up every year. And there's some weird things going on with Annie, Fanny, and Mike, and these often linked to big changes in the climate, El Nino being one of them. When we have a hot, dry winter, we often have very little soil moisture. That is very little water to evaporate in the summer, and so we don't get those storms like we had this year, the convective thunderstorms that go up and down all the way across the prairies. Instead, we have those scorching hot days, 30 plus for weeks on end, and no rain. So our concern is we've had dry weather for a while now, and while we got a foot of snow this year that probably dodged a drought, I wouldn't want to bet on it happening every year. That was really, really quite lucky. So when you take all this, what we do is we take all the data we've got, and then we do magic. We do statistics and modeling and all that sort of stuff that I'm actually useless at. Fortunately, other people in my lab are better than me. And we just ask, well, what are the things that are related to changes in greenness or clarity or surface scum? And it doesn't matter what these are. The main point here is the color combination for every single thing is a little bit different. So there's no one thing that you can say, right, if we do that, everything's good right across the board. If you're worried about the total greenness, well, here, what's this one? This is, the temperature is very important. Whereas if you're worried about water clarity, temperature's not that big a deal. And it depends on whether you got floaters or sinkers and that sort of thing. I can give you three sort of take-home messages to think about. The first is, based on the data that we've collected over 25 years, that if it gets warmer by 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 degrees, we will get more algae, we will get more total greenness, and we will get more surface scum. Why? Because Annie, Fanny, and Mike like it hot. You turn the heat on, they dig it. They really have fun with that. And so the problem is we are loading greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and the way greenhouse gases called radiatively active gases, because they are active when given light or radiation. They capture it, they absorb it, and what do? They just vibrate. We call that heat. So if you want to heat the atmosphere, put more gas in it to capture the energy, and that's what we're doing. We can see that if you reduce the amount of nutrients from a lot more than we have now to much less than we have, there is a straightforward decline. If we put fewer nutrients into the system, it will get less green and it will get clearer. And it will probably do so even if it gets warm, although there's still some debate about that. The third thing is, it really doesn't matter how much water you put down the pipe, down the Qu'Appelle. It is not going to have that big an effect. If you decrease the water to 1% of current river flow, which is basically dry, it's going to increase the greenness by 10%. Nothing. If you double the flow, it'll make it slightly better by 10%. In fact, to get anything near even a 50% change, you need to put more water in the river than the river can actually hold. Well, that's self-evident that that's not going to happen. So the idea of the solution to pollution is dilution is rubbish. It's not going to work, so don't worry about it. Worry about the things you can fix. You can fix nutrients. You can control how much greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere. You can't control the temperature of the atmosphere, but you've at least got the capability of doing something about it. But don't worry about how the water's running off the land. I mean, control it. We don't want flooding. But don't look at it as the solution, because it's not, in our evidence, it's not going to be one. So the conclusions to this, the water clarity, the greenness basically goes with, associated with temperature and water and nutrients. And temperature is a big one. Warmer water, due to global warming, will make the lakes greener. Getting rid of the nutrients will make them less green. The degree to which they trade off is still open to debate, but if you don't try, you aren't going to win. It's like playing the lotto. And then river flow, do it if you want, but it's not going to make a big difference. Let's finish off with this. So we had a pretty good story. I think the truth is we will improve the water quality by spending the money in the city of Regina. It had the tax base, it was worth doing it. There's a no regrets policy. You're taking out more pollution than you're putting in. How can that be a bad thing? Climate change, it's less easy to control, and so the challenges remain there, but if we're having debates at the provincial level about carbon taxes, if we're having debates about the made in Saskatchewan solution, then the solution needs to do something. The solution needs to reduce the things that are capturing the heat, because if it doesn't and it gets hotter, and the forecast for the prairies is 5 degrees or more warmer, that's twice as much green algae if you do nothing else. So telling your MLA that, hey, you saw this nerd at the Treaty Governance House, TP, and he said that this is bad, and then let them say no, and then let's have a debate about it. The other challenges, though, and some of these I don't have that much information on. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them and why I think this is things we need to think about. These are the 4 species that don't belong here. The ornamental species, species that come in on boats, species that have an effect on the environment. They often displace, disrupt, or kill the native species. They change how nutrients move around the environment. Some people think that if you put zebra mussels in the lakes, it'll clear the lakes out. It'll kill all the fish. Put money on that. Just watch. I'll predict that it'll be a collapse in the Lake Winnipeg fishery within 10 years because it's in that lake and it's not coming out. And the thing about invasive species is they're dead easy to put in. They're real tricky to get out. I want to talk about, we've talked about the Cold Lakes again. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this because I was assisting Chief Pegan with the judicial challenge. I provided the scientific affidavit for it. I'm going to talk about solution mines, potash, and then I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is fracking. So, in order to get a handle on this, one of my students actually surveyed about 500 people and asked, what do you know about invasive species? What do you know about non-native species? And the results were kind of worrying, actually. These are just the 6 that we talked about because they're very, very common, either threats or are already present. We said, do you know if they're here? Do you not know if they're here? What do you think? Almost everybody knew that invasive species existed. Most people knew about carp and goldfish. Oh yeah, you get flushed down the toilet and they end up in the lake. Yeah, right. They kind of know about purple loosestrife. And virtually nobody knows about these other ones, particularly zebra mussels. And the thing about zebra mussels that's so concerning is most everybody thought they were here. Forget it, they're already here. No, they're not. We're damn near surrounded, but they're not here yet. So there's lots of things we need to do to keep this in mind, but just being aware that they're not here and being aware that we need to keep an eye open on them. They've been pulled off of boats about to launch into Buffalo Pound Lake by conservation officers. So they're coming to a lake near you, and you just don't want them in the system. Okay, let's talk about the Quill Lakes a little bit. That's kind of in a nutshell what the problem is. You have a large area surrounded by agriculture, and you have very serious impacts on people. So what do you do? This lake has gone up 8 meters in 10 years, approximately the depth of this room. That's unprecedented. None of my colleagues will believe me. It's like, that's not possible. It is. And you know what? It used to be higher historically, like back in the Ice Age, when all the ice was melting, this was even higher, because there's beaches that you can see all the way around here that are way up still above the lake level. The problem is where to put the water if you want to divert it. You got 3 choices. You can go north to the Red Deer, you can go east to the Ebble, or you can do what the province planned to do, which was bring it through Peter Lake into Lanigan Creek, into Last Mountain Lake. And the province made the argument that, yeah, we're going to bring in a lot of water, 7 million cubic meters. That's a lot of water. But this is a massive lake. I calculated that it's about 0.1 of the volume of the lake. And they were going to bring in about 10 times less water than occurs in the average snowmelt. It wasn't going to be important. But the argument from the province is that, well, if you distribute it over the whole lake, it only changes the saltiness of the lake a little bit. That's awesome. But that's not where it's coming in. It's coming in right there. And that is not a massive lake. That is the National Wildlife Area. That is Canada's oldest national wildlife area, oldest national park. It's a central flyway for birds from the Gulf of Mexico to the north. The diversion would bring in 50,000 metric tons or more of salt. Now, I just have to say that number and you know that that's really not going to have, there's no way that's going to have no effect. The problem with the province, what the province did is it said, well, we don't need to do an environmental impacts assessment here because it's averaged out over the whole lake. And the argument that Chief Pegan made and that I supported was that no, that's not how water works. Water flows across the land and it comes in at a specific spot. So the challenge was not you're wrong, the challenge was you have to ask the question of what will happen. And if you ask that question, then you do an impacts assessment. The worrying thing about this is, I don't know if you noticed in the paper a couple of weeks back, there's a new potash mine that's going to be opened by Eyebrow Lake. Now you might remember from the start of my talk, Eyebrow Lake is the source waters for the Qu'Appelle. Diefenbaker, we bought a bunch of snowmelt from the Rockies across, but Eyebrow's where the Qu'Appelle starts. So the headwaters of the Qu'Appelle are going to have a new potash mine. And the plan is to take water out of the groundwater, the aquifer. Is that sustainable? I don't know, but the very first thing I would say is we need to check. The province has waived the need for an impacts assessment. Again, this is a problem. And the problem relating to water extraction is industrial extraction. A lot of the industry that we have in southern Saskatchewan to do with mining requires water. There's a number of potash mines. Now, let me explain first a little bit about this used to be an ancient sea, very shallow sea, that went pretty much all the way to the Rockies. Dinosaur Provincial Park, lots of dinosaurs. What are they doing there? Because that was the seashore, and if you're going to go get food, you go to the watering hole. And what better watering hole than a nice, productive, shallow sea with all sorts of things to eat? So all the dinosaur finds are over there, and we're out in the middle. Well, that sea, as the continent moved up and down, got cut off from the ocean in the north, and the water slowly evaporated. And what's in ocean water? Salt. So the water evaporated and evaporated and evaporated, and eventually you got a layer of salt, a bunch of layers of salt. Two types of salt. One is halite, which is sodium chloride table salt. The other is potash. And they're about 1.5 kilometers below us in layers. And this is pretty soft substrate around here, so if you dig a conventional mine, it'll probably collapse and kill people. Maybe not a good strategy. The alternate, which is a great engineering solution, is to drill down laterally. This salt layer is down about 1.5 kilometers. You take fresh water from the surface, which isn't salty, and you drill down and you let it dissolve the salt. And then you take that water, the salty water, and pump it up to the surface, and then you evaporate off the water. And what's left is crystallized salt. First you take out the halite, you leave it in a waste pile, and then you take out the potash and you put it in a Canpotex boxcar and you ship it off. And plants need this. This is a fertilizer. It helps them pick nutrients out of the soil. So it is true that it is a fertilizer. It is true that it's important for us provisioning ourselves in the future. There's where the water has to come from for these mines if all were developed. I probably don't need to say that there's a hell of a lot of pressure on Buffalo Pound Lake, which is also ultimately where the water's coming down the pipe for the Qu'Appelle. There's originally, one of the reasons I got involved originally because Vallée and Western were planning on taking water out of Qu'Appelle Lake. You may recall a while back that was a potential problem. And Chief Redmond from the Standing Buffalo Dakota First Nation filed a federal lawsuit to trigger an environmental impacts assessment. And again, the University of Regina and my lab supplied the scientific affidavit in support of the position that this needed an impacts assessment. Both cases, the Quill Lakes case and this case, were won. And I'm going to make the case at the end that the combination of Indigenous rights and scientific knowledge is pretty much unbeatable. And that we need to think hard about how to collaborate in the future. It's just some data, but basically these mines use an enormous amount of water. If you took all those mines and you took the water out of Buffalo Pound, it would drain Buffalo Pound and it would drain all the water in the Qu'Appelle. So what you do is, okay, then we bring more water over from Lake Diefenbaker and it's all good. Well, yeah, except that if you're going to drain it during winter, the water level is going to go down because frozen water doesn't flow so well. If you keep the water level up from conveyance, and then you have a big snowpack, guess what? You get flooding. So you can't win on this one. And then you have species in Saskatchewan that aren't found anywhere else on the planet, and you would think that it'd be a good idea to protect them. So the bigmouth buffalo, not the most attractive fish in the world, if truth be told, is native to this area and is endangered, is considered endangered at the provincial level. So why would you do things to the breeding habitat of bigmouth buffaloes, such as put 50,000 metric tons of salt into the north end of Last Mountain Lake? That's what the salt pile looks like. This is the waste salt from a potash mine. 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 300 meters high at full production. You can see how well maintained it is. It's a big pile of table salt. Ever had a picnic in the prairies? The wind comes up. What happens to the salt? Well, the same basic thing happens here. The salt moves all the way around out to about 5 kilometers. And you can check any salty lake like Old Wives Lake, and you'll see the same ring of salt all the way around it. Put the ring around all the potash mines. You've pretty much covered the entire drainage of Wascana Creek into the Qu'Appelle now. If these lakes come to full production, and just what has happened already just happens again. Now finally, what I like to call fracking oil. What is fracking? It's called hydraulic fracturing. You take water from the surface and you run it into a tube at such high pressure that it breaks the land. It fractures it. But what we're trying to do is extract more petrochemicals out of the land, and so you put in chemicals, and the combination of the chemicals, the deep injection, and the oil will prevent that water from being used for anything ever again. It might evaporate, and evaporation is quite cleansing. Going up into the atmosphere helps get rid of contaminants. So why would we do fracking? Well, here's the production of oil in Saskatchewan over the, whatever that is, 70-odd years. You can see it's been pretty flat here for the last 15 or so years, but then there's this kind of a pop up in was in fact this is cut off, but the last 10 years or so. Why? This is a bit hard to follow, but let's step through it quickly. So this is the total number of wells by 2005 that used fracking. 63. Here we are a few years ago. Total number of wells using fracking, 7,700. I'm going to say that that's probably the reason oil production's gone up, but it's gone up at the expense of water. We're using water to produce the thing that makes the atmosphere warm and makes our water worse. Great, we're doubling down on ruining the water. Terrific. This caught me by surprise. It was actually a PhD student at Toronto who interviewed me and said, well, what do you think about water things in the prairies? And I rolled out my usual, oh, I think about this, I'm a professor, and I think about that. And then she sent me the report back and said, oh, by the way, you should read this. And I read it, and it was just like, and it literally said, experts haven't a clue about fracking in Saskatchewan. Okay, mea culpa, I see that. Given the importance of resources to the provincial economy, I think it's a done deal that we'll see more pressure to extract potash and more pressure to extract petroleum chemicals, and that it will cost us in terms of water in the area where there's not enough water to grow trees. Okay, so enough negativity. What do we do? This is a lot of words, so I'm going to step through it slowly, but I'm just trying to give us some energy. With respect to invasive species, ignorance is our enemy. We must become aware of how they get into the system. They hitch a ride on boats. You go to Manitoba, you launch your boat there, you need to disinfect your boat before you bring it back to Saskatchewan, and then you need to disinfect it again before you put it into the lakes. You need to be aware that you can't even see these things sometimes. If they're the young, they're completely clear. You can't look at your boat and go, oh, there's nothing there, there's no shells. It's not that simple. We need to reconsider past land uses. So the Quill Lakes thing is much more complicated than I'm letting on. The question of why the lake level went up remains hotly debated. There's no question that it's snowed more in a band from about Brandon up to about Lloydminster and about 50 miles wide. And there's been more snow, there's been more runoff, and it's getting to the lakes, and all the lakes in that band are going up. But this is also an area of very intensive drainage. Most of it, what has recently been deemed illegal. And it would all be made legal if the water was simply drained from the Quill Lakes into Last Mountain Lake. So now you can start asking yourself, is there something else going on here? Wouldn't it be easier to just buy out 4, 5, 6 farms that were flooded, turn it into a wildlife area, let the birds nest the way they would normally? Why such pressure to drain water out of Quill Lakes? Maybe it's because there's something else going on there. So reconsidering our land uses, I think, is important. Protecting the wetlands. There are biofilters. They often, the plants grow at the inflow of water into a lake where the water starts to slow down but still has a lot of nutrients. Protecting that biofilter helps us. I've got it in the wrong spot here, but tomorrow the members of the University of Regina that will be in the Treaty 4 parade will be handing out wetland kits to help reestablish. So these are species that we know come from Saskatchewan and belong in Saskatchewan, and all you have to do is plant one in your wetland, in your lakeshore, in your stream, next to the land, and hopefully let it grow. Try not to pull stuff out of the shallow water. Try and leave it be. It's actually good for fish to have rocks and stumps and branches. This is where they nest. This is where they breed. This is where they escape predators. You pull it all out, and they're just naked there, and they get pounded. Look to the future. We are going to use more water. We are going to take out more oil. Every raise I ever get for the rest of my life will be tied to potash. That's almost a certainty. So saying no is probably not a strategy, at least not one that the government will listen to. So how do we, this is the idea of sustainable development. Sustainable development doesn't mean more. It means replacing or developing or improving. So how do we get our cake and eat it too? Is there any way to, we have half of the world's potash. In 30 years, there's going to be 3 billion more people on the planet. They're going to need food, and we've got all the fertilizer. What's the reason for a fire sale now? Why do we have to get all the potash development this second? And so what I've got here is consider 7 generations to the future. Consider what you want your grandkids to experience. What is Saskatchewan in 150 years now? Or do you not think there is going to be a Saskatchewan? We just need to look further, back and further into the future. With respect to fracking and the ideas like clean coal, and I apologize, this is kind of insulting some of my colleagues at the university, we need to shine a light on industrial practices, get ahead of the curve, raise the issue before it's too late, before it's an issue. If you think that the information I presented about fracking is an issue, write somebody, get involved, say something about it now, because there's already 7,000 mines and there's drills sites. And there's going to be more, and there's just not that much more water. It's not like we're going to run out of water. It's going to snow, it's going to rain. But we really don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of rain and snow. Forecasts for temperature in the prairies, for climate change, it's going to be warmer. But we don't know if it's going to be wetter or drier. So how, are you willing to bet the farm literally on this? And I'm going to say that move away from fossil fuels earlier than later. We are going to be the dog wagging, the tail wagging the dog. We're going to be the last people to the party on this one if we don't step it up. We have the power. We have the capability. This is not it's not rocket science. It's not that hard. And it's not like there's no alternates. They just need to remove the disincentives. I mean, why do we have to sell solar power back to the province if you produce too much of it? This is ludicrous. So I'm going to suggest that we need to start thinking again further into the future. And just a plug for my colleague Carrie Finley at the university, who's involved in citizen science. Citizen science is getting everybody involved to feel engaged with things. This is not citizen science. This is me yakking at you. If you want, there's cell apps developed that you can take a photo of the lake and it uploads it and it tells us how green the water is. Or there's this global Secchi-dipathon, which is you take that little black and white disc and you sink it in the lake and you measure where it goes away and when it comes back. And we're doing that across the entire planet. Then we're going to tie that into the satellite images and try and understand how the satellites are recording what's going on the planet. We don't have enough scientists to do this, but we have enough people. And then to conclude, I'm just going to say that we need to support Indigenous treaty rights. The Indigenous peoples have the right to the environment, and we are all treaty people. The United Nations makes this abundantly clear. Access to clean water is an inalienable human right. So with that, I'll take some questions if you have any. Thank you.